The harsh summer sun beat down on the dusty main street of Blackwater Creek, a frontier town nestled between rolling prairies and jagged mountains in Wyoming Territory. 1878. Sheriff James Harrington stood on the wooden porch of his office, thumbs hooked in his belt, weathered face surveying his domain with vigilant blue eyes that had seen too much death. At 52, the lawman's once dark hair had given way to silver at the temples, and deep lines mapped his face like the terrain he'd spent decades protecting. The badge on his chest caught the sunlight, a symbol of order in a land still wild and untamed. "Pa," the Hanson boy said, "there's trouble brewing at the Silver Dollar again," called Elizabeth Harrington, as she stepped out of their modest home adjacent to the jailhouse. At 20, Elizabeth, Lizzie to most, was the picture of frontier beauty with her chestnut hair and determined green eyes that matched her mother's, now 7 years in the grave. She wore a practical blue dress, her sleeves rolled up from helping Mrs. Peterson with laundry. Said too, cattle drivers from the Carson outfit are threatening to shoot each other over a card game. The sheriff sighed, reaching for the worn Stetson hanging on a peg. "Always something with those Carson boys. You stay put, Lizzie. I mean it." He fixed his daughter with a stern gaze that had made many a hardened outlaw confess. "And remember what I told you about the guns. Don't even look at them while I'm gone." His hand instinctively checked the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, the weapon that had kept them both alive through years of frontier justice. Lizzie's jaw tightened in that stubborn way that reminded him so much of her mother. "I'm not a child anymore. Pa, every woman out here needs to know how to handle a firearm. What if someone comes while you're away? What then?" Her words hung in the dry air between them, an argument revisited countless times since her mother had died from a stray bullet during a bank robbery gone wrong. The sheriff had sworn then that his daughter would never touch a gun, never face the dangers that had stolen his wife. "We're not having this discussion again," he said, voice firm as iron. "The answer is no, same as yesterday and all the days before. I keep this town safe so you don't have to." With that, he settled his hat on his head and strode purposefully down the street toward the saloon, boot spurs jingling with each determined step. Lizzie watched him go, frustration simmering in her chest like a pot left too long on the stove. "One day you'll understand I'm not trying to be difficult," she murmured to his retreating back. "I'm trying to survive." The young woman turned and went back inside, closing the door perhaps a bit harder than necessary. The small house felt confining suddenly, the walls pressing in with all her father's rules and protections. Through the window, she could see down the side street to where a group of cowboys had ridden in, their horses now hitched outside the general store. One man stood apart from the others, tall and lean in a dusty black coat, with a quiet intensity about him that caught her attention. In the heart of Blackwater Creek, the Silver Dollar Saloon erupted in a cacophony of shouts and breaking glass. Sheriff Harrington pushed through the batwing doors to find 2 men facing off, one with a bloody nose and the other brandishing a whiskey bottle like a club. The piano player had wisely abandoned his post, leaving the instrument silent as the crowd pressed against the walls. "That's enough." The sheriff's voice cut through the chaos, his hand resting meaningfully on his holstered revolver. "Carson's men or not, I'll throw you both in a cell so fast your heads will spin." Miles away across the rolling prairie, a different kind of tension was building. 3 riders moved steadily toward Blackwater Creek, dust clouds marking their progress. Frank Dalton led the way, his face half hidden by a red bandana, eyes cold as river stones in winter. Behind him rode his brothers, Cole and Jesse, equally hard-faced men with reputations built on violence. "Sheriff won't be expecting us," Frank said, checking the Winchester rifle secured to his saddle. "Not after all this time. Harrington thinks we're still in Colorado territory." The cowboy in the black coat caught Lizzie's eye through the general store window as she walked past on her way to the telegraph office with a message from her father. Something about him seemed different from the usual rough men who passed through Blackwater Creek. Perhaps the book tucked into his saddlebag, or the careful way he selected supplies, rather than grabbing the first items at hand. He glanced up, tipped his hat politely, then returned to his business. The small gesture of respect was refreshing in a town where many men either leered or treated her with excessive caution due to her father's position. "Miss Harrington," called Mr. Finch from the telegraph office as she approached. "I was just about to send someone for you. Got a wire for your father, marked urgent." The thin man handed her a yellow slip of paper, his expression grave behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Lizzie scanned the message, her blood running cold at the words. "Dalton brothers spotted heading your way. Responsible for Deadwood stagecoach robbery and murder of 2 guards. Considered armed and extremely dangerous." The date was yesterday, which meant the Daltons could arrive any time. Her father needed this information immediately. The sheriff had just managed to separate the 2 brawlers at the saloon when Lizzie burst through the doors, the telegraph clutched in her hand. Conversations died as heads turned toward the sheriff's daughter. Women rarely entered the saloon, especially unescorted. "Pa, you need to see this now," she said, ignoring the stares and whispers. Sheriff Harrington frowned at her presence but took the paper. His expression darkened as he read, years of lawman's instinct setting his nerves on edge. The Dalton brothers had been on wanted posters for years, but this was personal. Frank Dalton had killed his deputy in a shootout 5 years ago before escaping into the territories. "Listen up," the sheriff announced to the saloon patrons, his voice carrying authority built over decades wearing the badge. "I need every able-bodied man who can handle a firearm to meet me at the jailhouse in 15 minutes. The Dalton gang is headed this way." A murmur swept through the crowd. Some men looked eager for action, others nervous or calculating their chances of staying uninvolved. "Lizzie, go home and lock the doors. Don't come out until I come for you, understand?" His tone brooked no argument, and for once she nodded without protest. The situation was too grave for their usual disagreement. As Lizzie hurried back toward home, she passed the cowboy in the black coat again, now loading supplies onto his horse. He looked up at her rushed pace, noting the concern on her face. "Trouble coming, miss?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his stature. She hesitated, unsure whether to share the news with a stranger, but something in his steady gaze made her stop. "Dalton brothers are headed to town," she said simply. "My father, the sheriff, is gathering men." The cowboy nodded thoughtfully, securing the last of his packages. "Matthew Reeves," he offered by way of introduction. "I've crossed paths with the Daltons before. I'll go speak with your father." Back at the jailhouse, Sheriff Harrington distributed rifles and ammunition to a hastily assembled group of townsmen. Some, like blacksmith Fergus Mackenzie, were steady and reliable. Others, like the saloon owner and a few ranchers, seemed less certain but determined to protect their town. The sheriff was explaining his plan when Matthew Reeves entered, his presence immediately commanding attention. "Sheriff," he said with a respectful nod, "your daughter mentioned the Daltons. I tracked them for the Wells Fargo Company last year after the Clearwater robbery. I know how they operate." Lizzie paced the floor of the small house, peering occasionally through the curtains at the men organizing in front of the jailhouse. Her father's expression was grim as he pointed toward the town's entrances, clearly assigning positions. The cowboy, Reeves, stood at his side, drawing something in the dirt with a stick, likely a map or plan. She recognized the tactics from watching her father work over the years. The familiar fear gripped her heart, the same terror she'd felt as a 13-year-old when they'd told her mother was never coming home. How many times would she have to watch her father walk toward danger, armed and ready to die for a town that barely paid him enough to keep them fed? The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across Blackwater Creek. Most townsfolk had retreated indoors after hearing about the coming danger, leaving the streets eerily quiet save for the occasional gust of wind stirring up dust devils. Sheriff Harrington had positioned men at strategic points, the roofs of the general store and bank, behind water troughs and inside doorways with clear sightlines to the main approaches. He and Reeves stood on the jailhouse porch, watchful and tense. "Your daughter," Reeves said quietly. "She's alone at your house." The sheriff nodded, his jaw tight. "Best place for her to be. Safest spot in town is away from whatever's about to happen." The Dalton brothers crested the low hill overlooking Blackwater Creek, just as the setting sun painted the sky in violent shades of orange and red. Frank studied the town through a brass spyglass, noting the unusual stillness. "Something's not right," he muttered. "Town's too quiet." Cole spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Maybe they're having a church service or something." Frank shook his head, collapsing the spyglass with a snap. "Nah, they know we're coming. Change of plans will come in from the east behind the livery. Hit the bank quick, then out the same way. No time for settling scores with Harrington today." A sharp crack split the silence, a dry branch breaking under a horse's hoof, followed by hushed voices just beyond the edge of town. Lizzie froze at the window, her heart pounding in her chest. Through the fading light, she could make out 3 riders approaching cautiously from the east, not the main road where her father and most of the men were watching. They were heading directly past the house toward the rear of the bank, keeping to the shadows. One wore a red bandana that covered the lower half of his face, exactly as described in the wanted posters for Frank Dalton that hung in her father's office. They were going to slip right past the town's defenses, and no one would see them until it was too late. Without stopping to think, Lizzie slipped out the back door and hugged the shadows of buildings as she made her way toward the jailhouse. She had to warn her father, had to tell him the Daltons were coming from the east, not the main road. But as she reached the corner of the feed store, a rough hand clamped over her mouth, and she was dragged backward into the narrow space between 2 buildings. "Well, what do we have here?" hissed a voice like gravel in her ear. "Looks like the sheriff's little girl is out past her bedtime." The smell of tobacco and unwashed clothes filled her nostrils as Frank Dalton held her firmly, a knife pressing against her ribs. "You're going to be our insurance, miss. Your daddy won't risk a shot if we've got you along for the ride." At the jailhouse, the tension had stretched to a breaking point as darkness fell completely over Blackwater Creek. "They should have been here by now," muttered the sheriff, peering into the gloom. Matthew Reeves stood silently beside him, his experienced eyes scanning the shadows between buildings. "Unless they're not coming up the main road," he said suddenly, straightening. "Sheriff, where's the back entrance to the bank?" Understanding dawned on Harrington's face, followed quickly by alarm. "And Lizzie," he started, then froze as a figure emerged from the darkness of the alley across the street. Frank Dalton stepped into a pool of lantern light, one arm wrapped around Lizzie's throat, the other holding a revolver to her head. "Evening, Sheriff," called Frank, his voice carrying in the still night air. Behind him, his brothers emerged with rifles ready, covering the rooftops where the sheriff's men were positioned. "Been a long time. Thought we'd pay a social call, but seems you were expecting us. Not very hospitable." Lizzie stood rigid in his grip, her eyes locked on her father's agonized face. The sheriff's hand hovered near his holster, but he didn't draw. "Let her go, Frank. This is between you and me." Frank laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "Now why would I do that when she's keeping you from filling me with lead? We're going to take a little walk to the bank, and your men are going to stay right where they are, or the girl gets it first." Matthew Reeves had slipped into the shadows the moment the Daltons appeared, moving with a silence that spoke of years tracking prey across unforgiving terrain. Now he worked his way around the buildings, coming up behind the livery where the Daltons had left their horses. If he could reach the sheriff's daughter, create a distraction. But he needed to be careful. One wrong move could get her killed. As he edged closer, he caught a glimpse of Lizzie's face in the lantern light. Where he expected to see terror, he instead saw calculation in her eyes. She was looking for an opportunity, not frozen in fear. That changed things. He wouldn't be rescuing a helpless girl, but potentially providing an opening for someone ready to act. "Open the safe, old man," Cole Dalton ordered the bank manager, who fumbled with shaking hands at the combination lock. They had forced their way into the bank, using Lizzie as a shield against the sheriff and his men who followed helplessly at a distance. Frank kept his gun pressed to Lizzie's temple, while Jesse watched the street through the bank's large front window. "Hurry up," snapped Cole as the manager struggled with the dial. Outside, Sheriff Harrington stood in the street, surrounded by his deputies and the townsmen who had volunteered to fight. His face was a mask of barely controlled rage and fear. A father watching his child in mortal danger, a lawman facing the outlaws who had eluded him for years. In the tense silence of the bank, Lizzie's mind raced. Her father had always protected her, kept her away from violence and danger. But her mother's death had taught her that protection could fail in an instant. All these years, she had wanted to learn to defend herself, to handle a weapon, not out of rebellion but survival. Now, held at gunpoint, she realized that knowing how to shoot wouldn't help if she couldn't reach a gun. Frank's revolver was pressed against her head, his other hand gripping her arm. But on his belt, partially hidden by his long coat, was a second pistol, a smaller Colt that might be her only chance if she could reach it. The bank manager finally got the safe open, revealing stacks of currency and several bags of gold coins, the payroll for the nearby mining operation that had arrived by stage just 2 days earlier. Cole began stuffing the money into saddlebags, keeping his rifle trained on the manager. "Frank, we got it. Let's move," he called over his shoulder. Frank started backing toward the door, dragging Lizzie with him. "Jesse, get the horses," he ordered his younger brother, who slipped out the back door of the bank. Outside, the sheriff and his men tensed, reading the signs of the robbers' imminent exit. Matthew Reeves had positioned himself in the shadows beside the bank, waiting for the moment to act. "What's your plan once you're on your horses?" Lizzie asked suddenly, her voice surprisingly steady. "My pa has men all over town. You won't make it to the edge of Blackwater Creek." Frank's grip tightened painfully on her arm. "Shut your mouth, girl." But Lizzie continued, needing to distract him, to create the moment she needed. "Those men out there, they're not just scared townfolk. That tall one in the black coat, he's a bounty hunter who's been tracking you since Clearwater. He knows exactly how you operate." It was a calculated risk, revealing Reeves' presence, but she needed to shake Frank's confidence, make him think about something other than the gun at her head. The ploy worked. Frank's eyes darted to the street, scanning the faces until he found Reeves standing in the shadows. "That's Sonovabich," he muttered, his grip on the gun momentarily loosening as his attention split. It was the opening Lizzie had been waiting for. In one fluid motion, she twisted in his grip and grabbed for the second pistol on his belt. Her fingers closed around the smooth wooden grip, and she yanked it free before Frank could react. She stumbled backward, breaking his hold entirely, the stolen Colt now pointed at his chest. "Don't move," she said, surprised at the steadiness of her own voice and hands. Frank froze, genuine shock registering on his face at being disarmed by a sheriff's daughter. "Lizzie!" Sheriff Harrington's voice cracked with emotion from the doorway, where he now stood with his peacemaker aimed at Frank Dalton. Behind him, the townsmen had their weapons trained on Cole, who had dropped his saddlebags of money but still clutched his rifle. The tableau held for a breathless moment, father and daughter with guns drawn on the infamous Dalton brothers, whose legendary run of robberies and murders had come to an unexpected end at the hands of a young woman who had never fired a shot in her life. "Put it down, Lizzie," the sheriff said, his voice gentler now. "I've got him. It's over." But Lizzie didn't lower the pistol. Her eyes remained locked on Frank Dalton, the man who had killed her father's deputy, who had been prepared to kill her without hesitation. "No, Pa," she said with quiet determination. "Today I learn. I learn to protect what matters, just like you've always done." She adjusted her grip on the revolver, holding it exactly as she had seen her father do countless times. "I learn because next time, you might not be here to save me, and I refuse to be helpless again." Frank Dalton's eyes narrowed as he calculated his chances, clearly not believing she would actually pull the trigger. His hand twitched slightly toward the knife in his boot. The shot rang out with deafening clarity in the confined space of the bank, the flash momentarily illuminating Lizzie's resolute face. Frank Dalton cried out, clutching his shoulder where a bloom of red spread across his shirt. He staggered backward, collapsing against the teller's counter, his face contorted with pain and disbelief. Lizzie held the smoking pistol with rock-steady hands, her expression calm but determined. "I aimed for your shoulder on purpose," she told him, voice clear in the stunned silence that followed the gunshot. "That's the difference between us, Mr. Dalton. I don't shoot to kill unless I have to." Behind her, Sheriff Harrington looked at his daughter with a mixture of shock, pride, and the painful recognition that she was no longer the child he had been trying to protect. Matthew Reeves entered through the back door, dragging a subdued Jesse Dalton with him. "Caught him trying to bring the horses around," he explained, pushing the youngest Dalton brother toward the sheriff. "Seems the family business is closed for good." The townsmen moved in to secure the outlaws, binding their wounds and their hands with practiced efficiency. Through it all, Lizzie stood apart, still holding the pistol she had taken from Frank Dalton, her face thoughtful as the implications of what she had done settled over her. She had defied her father, taken a gun, and shot a man, actions that would have been unimaginable to her just hours earlier. Yet she felt no regret, only a strange sense of clarity, as though a fog had lifted from her future. Later, as dawn broke over Blackwater Creek, Sheriff Harrington found his daughter sitting on the porch of their home, watching the first golden rays touch the distant mountains. The Dalton brothers were locked securely in the jail, awaiting transport to the territorial court for trial. The town was still buzzing with excitement over their capture and the unexpected role played by the sheriff's daughter. "Lizzie," he said softly, lowering himself to sit beside her on the step, "about what happened." She turned to face him, her green eyes clear and direct. "I'm not sorry, Pa. I can't be sorry for saving my own life, or maybe yours too." The sheriff nodded slowly, the weight of years evident in the slump of his shoulders. "Your mother," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "she was like you, determined, brave. When that bullet took her, I swore I'd never let anything happen to you. Thought keeping you away from guns, away from the violence, was the way to do that." He looked down at his weathered hands, the hands that had held a gun for most of his adult life. "But last night, watching you face down Frank Dalton, I realized I've been wrong all these years. Keeping you ignorant didn't make you safer. It just made you more vulnerable." A tear tracked down his lined cheek, catching the early morning light. "I almost lost you because of my own fear." Matthew Reeves approached the Harrington house as the morning sun cleared the eastern hills, leading his saddled horse. He had planned to leave Blackwater Creek at first light, but something held him back. Unfinished business, perhaps, or a curiosity about the sheriff's remarkable daughter. Sheriff Harrington looked up at his approach, offering a nod of respect to the man who had helped bring down the Dalton gang. "Heading out?" he asked, rising to his feet. Reeves nodded, adjusting the pack on his horse. "Thought I might, but then reconsidered. Telegram came in early this morning about another outfit causing trouble up near the Montana border. Sheriff up there's asking for experienced help." Lizzie listened to the exchange, studying Matthew Reeves in the clear light of morning. There was something compelling about the quiet competence he radiated, so different from the blustering confidence of most men she knew. "Mr. Reeves," she said, standing up to join the conversation, "I want to thank you for your help last night." He tipped his hat with a small smile. "No need for thanks, Miss Harrington. You did most of the hard work yourself." She returned his smile, then looked at her father with determination in her eyes. "Pa, I have a proposition for you both. Mr. Reeves needs help with this new situation up north, and I need someone to teach me properly how to handle a firearm." Sheriff Harrington looked between his daughter and the bounty hunter, understanding dawning on his weathered face. "You want to go with him, Lizzie. Capturing the Daltons is one thing, but—" she held up a hand to stop him. "Not as some kind of deputy or bounty hunter, Pa. But I need to learn, really learn from someone who knows what they're doing, and after last night. Can you honestly say I shouldn't?" The sheriff fell silent, the truth of her words sinking in. Finally, he turned to Reeves. "You willing to take on a student? One who's already proven she's got more natural talent than most men I've deputized over the years." Matthew Reeves considered the offer, looking at Lizzie with newfound respect. "It would be an honor, Sheriff, but I'd need your word that I'm teaching her to protect herself, not putting her in harm's way. We'd stay clear of any actual confrontations." The sheriff nodded slowly, the decision clearly difficult but necessary. 2 weeks. You bring her back in 2 weeks, and if you've put her in danger, I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth. It wasn't a threat but a promise, father to man. Reeves extended his hand and the sheriff shook it, sealing the arrangement. Lizzie looked between them, a mix of excitement and solemnity in her expression. She had crossed a threshold the previous night, from protected daughter to a woman capable of defending herself and others. There was no going back, only forward into whatever the western frontier held for her. As the sun climbed higher over Blackwater Creek, Lizzie packed a small bag with essentials for the journey. Through the window, she could see her father and Matthew Reeves deep in conversation on the porch, no doubt establishing ground rules for her unexpected apprenticeship. The pistol she had taken from Frank Dalton lay wrapped in a cloth on her bed. Her father had allowed her to keep it as a reminder of the night everything changed. She picked it up, feeling its weight and significance. "Today I learn," she whispered to herself, echoing the words that had marked her transformation. Not just how to shoot, but how to stand on her own in a world that rarely offered second chances, especially to women. Outside, in the clear morning light, a new chapter of her life awaited, as vast and promising as the western horizon itself. The town of Blackwater Creek would long remember the night the sheriff's daughter took down the notorious Dalton gang. Some would tell it as a tale of a father's worst fears realized then overcome, others as the story of a young woman's courage in the face of mortal danger. But for Elizabeth Harrington, riding north beside Matthew Reeves toward the Montana Territory, it was simply the first day of her real education, the beginning of understanding the true meaning of her father's lifelong commitment to justice. The stolen pistol now rode in a proper holster at her hip, no longer forbidden but accepted as both tool and responsibility. Behind them, the dusty streets of Blackwater Creek receded into the distance, and ahead lay lessons in survival, self-reliance, and the complex balance between power and restraint that every person who carries a weapon must learn to master. Sheriff James Harrington watched his daughter disappear over the northern ridge, his heart heavy with the bittersweet recognition that children must eventually find their own path, even when that path leads away from the safety parents try so desperately to provide. He fingered the telegram in his pocket, the one that had arrived just after Lizzie and Reeves departed, confirmation that the Daltons would stand trial for their crimes in the territorial court, finally bringing closure to years of pursuit and the loss of good men to their violence. Justice would be served, though not in the way he had always imagined. The sheriff turned back toward town, toward the jail where 3 notorious outlaws now sat defeated not by his gun, but by his daughter's courage and determination. Perhaps, he reflected, that was the greatest justice of all. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.